Imagine a world where your creativity was chained, where your voice was silenced before it even found its tune. What if the very era you lived in actively conspired against your artistic dreams? Step back with us to the year 1108. What did it truly mean to be a woman with a creative spirit in that distant, rigid world? What were the invisible walls that rose around every aspiring female artist, every visionary mind, every woman yearning to express herself? Number 10. Cultural norms and the definition of art. Picture this, it's the early 12th century, the year 1108. You're a woman with a nimble mind and clever hands. Perhaps you excel at intricate needlework, spinning fine threads into surprisingly strong yarns, or weaving complex patterns that tell stories. Maybe you have a knack for mixing herbs and pigments to create beautiful dyes, or you can craft stunning pottery from clay, even if it's just for your household. Perhaps you're a gifted storyteller, able to captivate listeners with tales passed down through generations, singing songs with melodies that touch the soul. Today, we might instantly recognize these skills as forms of artistic expression. We'd see the dedication, the innovation, the beauty. But in 1108, the definition of art was far narrower, and this narrow view became a massive, often invisible, barrier for women. Think about what was considered high art back then. Talking about monumental architecture, cathedrals rising to the heavens. Talking about detailed illuminated manuscripts, breathtaking in their gold leaf and vibrant colors, often religious texts. Talking about grand sculptures, frescoes covering church walls, and intricate metalwork used for chalices and crosses. These were creations of immense scale, often requiring significant resources, specialized training, and a public presence. They were almost exclusively commissioned by powerful institutions like the church or wealthy noblemen, and they were, without exception, created by men. Now, consider the skills women typically possessed and refined. They were masters of the domestic sphere. They spun wool, linen, and silk into threads. They wove these threads into cloth for clothing, blankets, and tapestries. They embroidered scenes, patterns, and symbols onto these materials. They prepared food, often with artistic flair in presentation or the careful blending of flavors. They managed households, which involved a surprising amount of practical design and aesthetic arrangement. Cultivated gardens, understanding the beauty and utility of plants. Crucially, they were the keepers of oral traditions, lullabies, folk songs, stories, and poems passed down through generations, often performed during long winter evenings or while working together. Cultural framework of 1108 didn't view these activities through the same lens as the grand arts of men. Spinning, weaving, cooking, even storytelling were often seen as crafts or household duties, necessary for survival and the functioning of society, but not necessarily elevated to the status of a fine art. There was no market for a woman's embroidered masterpiece beyond her immediate family, no grand exhibition for her carefully dyed textiles, no recognition for the beauty of a meal she prepared, unless perhaps for a lord. The act of creating a stunning piece of clothing or a beautiful tapestry, which might have taken weeks or months of dedicated labor, was simply women's work. It was expected. It was practical. It was not, in the eyes of the dominant culture, art that warranted public display, individual recognition, or financial patronage. This isn't to say that the women creating these things didn't find beauty or satisfaction in their work. Many undoubtedly did. The very act of creation is inherently fulfilling. The societal perception, the lack of a formal category or public appreciation for their expressive output, created a profound limitation. A woman might spend her entire life perfecting the art of weaving complex patterns, creating textiles that were both functional and stunningly beautiful, but she would never be recognized as an artist in the way a male stonemason or manuscript illuminator would be. Creations remained largely anonymous, confined to the domestic sphere, or simply seen as part of her duty. Historical accounts from the High Middle Ages, often focused on the lives of elite men or the records of religious institutions, rarely even mention the artistic contributions of ordinary women. If a woman in a convent created an exquisite manuscript, it was often attributed to the convent itself or the male head of the order, not to the individual sister. If a weaver's wife produced particularly fine wool, it was simply part of the family's trade, overseen by the husband. The very language used to describe these activities reinforced their lower status. They were skills or trades, not art in the grand sense. Imagine the psychological impact of this. Your most profound expressions of beauty and skill are constantly relegated to a lower tier. If they are simply seen as a necessary part of your daily chores, how does that affect your desire to pursue them? How does it impact your access to resources or opportunities to further develop your talents? The answer is clear. It stifled innovation, discouraged ambition, and kept women's artistic contributions hidden within the private realm. The very definition of art in 1108 was a cage restricting female expression by simply not acknowledging it as such. It was a silent, cultural verdict that whispered, "This is not worthy of recognition." Number 9. Health and childbearing demands. Let's paint a picture of daily life for women in 1108. Forget about modern medicine, pain relief, or widespread sanitation. Life was brutally physical, and for women, it was dominated by the relentless cycles of childbearing. This wasn't just a personal matter, it was a profound societal expectation and a biological reality that dramatically limited a woman's time, energy, and physical capacity for sustained artistic expression. The average woman in 1108 would likely spend a significant portion of her fertile years either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or nursing an infant. Marriage often occurred in the mid to late teens, and women were expected to begin having children almost immediately. Without birth control and with high infant mortality rates, women often experienced many pregnancies, perhaps 8, 10, or even more, in an attempt to ensure some children survived to adulthood. Pregnancy was a physically demanding ordeal, and childbirth itself was incredibly dangerous, a leading cause of death for women during this period. Imagine trying to devote yourself to the painstaking detail required for an illuminated manuscript, or the physical exertion of weaving on a large loom, or the long hours of preparing complex natural dyes, all while battling constant nausea, exhaustion, or the physical toll of a recent delivery. Physical demands of daily life for a medieval woman were already immense: grinding grain, fetching water, cooking over open fires, tending to livestock, cleaning, and caring for young children. These chores were labor-intensive and left little room for leisure, let alone the concentrated effort needed for artistic pursuits. Consider the example of a woman who might have had a natural talent for carving wood. This would require physical strength, steady hands, and significant chunks of uninterrupted time. How would she manage this when she was often weakened by pregnancy, dealing with the aftermath of a difficult birth, or constantly attending to the needs of a crying infant or a toddler who needed constant supervision? Even less physically demanding arts, like fine embroidery or careful drawing, would have been challenging. Eye strain, fatigue, and the sheer lack of quiet, private time would have been enormous obstacles. Furthermore, medieval households were bustling places. Privacy was a luxury rarely afforded, especially to women. A woman's day was communal, spent alongside family members, children, and perhaps servants or apprentices. Finding a quiet corner, free from interruption, to focus on a creative project would have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The rhythm of her day was dictated by the needs of her household and her children, not by her personal creative impulses. Constant threat of illness, for both mother and child, also played a role. Medieval society was riddled with diseases, and basic hygiene was poor. Fevers, infections, and common ailments could incapacitate a person for weeks. For a woman, this meant not only her own suffering, but the added burden of caring for sick children, who often succumbed to illnesses that are easily treatable today. The emotional and physical toll of mourning lost children would have been immense, undoubtedly impacting any capacity for artistic expression. Historical records, though sparse on individual women's artistic endeavors, tell us much about life expectancy and common causes of death. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and the understanding of women's health was even less developed. This wasn't a matter of personal choice or ambition, it was the biological and social reality of the era. The expectation was that a woman's primary contribution to society was through childbearing and household management. Her body and her time were largely considered resources for the family and the community. Any artistic talent she possessed was secondary, something to be indulged only if it did not interfere with her fundamental duties, which, given the sheer scale of those duties and the physical toll of her life, was rarely the case. Even for women who entered convents, where some artistic expression, particularly manuscript illumination, did occur, the demands of monastic life, while different from domestic life, still involved communal living, manual labor, and religious duties that took precedence over individual artistic pursuits. While a nun might contribute to an illuminated manuscript, her work was often integrated into a larger, communal effort and often remained anonymous. So, when we consider women's artistic expression in 1108, we must always remember the profound and often overwhelming physical and emotional realities of their lives. Constant demands of childbearing, the relentless cycle of domestic labor, and the ever-present threat of illness combined to create a formidable barrier, leaving precious little time, energy, or peace of mind for the pursuit of art. It was a limitation born of biology and compounded by the harsh realities of the medieval world, shaping the lives of millions and profoundly restricting the creative output we might otherwise have seen. Number 8, lack of recognition and attribution. Imagine pouring your heart and soul into a creation, perhaps spending countless hours meticulously illustrating a page in a book or weaving a complex tapestry, only for your name to be completely erased from its history. In 1108, this wasn't just a possibility, it was a deeply ingrained norm, a silent agreement that denied women individual recognition for their artistic contributions. This pervasive lack of attribution acted as a significant, though often invisible, limit on women's artistic expression. In the High Middle Ages, individual artistic genius, as we understand it today, was rarely celebrated, even for men. Most art was created as part of a workshop, a monastic scriptorium, or under the patronage of a powerful lord or the church. Focus was on the output, the purpose of the art, rather than the specific individual who created it. However, within this collective approach, men were still far more likely to be acknowledged, even if subtly, as the master of a workshop or the head of a project. For women, even this limited form of recognition was exceedingly rare. Consider the role of women in convents. Monasteries and convents were often centers of learning and artistic production, particularly in the creation of illuminated manuscripts. Some of the most stunning examples of medieval art come from these religious houses. We know that women in convents, especially those from noble families who brought dowries of books and wealth, participated in the copying and illumination of texts. They learned to prepare parchment, mix pigments, and painstakingly apply gold leaf. Yet, the vast majority of these beautiful works remain anonymous. If a scribe or illuminator signed their work, it was almost always a man. If a woman did contribute, her contribution was typically folded into the communal effort of the convent, attributed to the abbess, or simply left unsigned. The collective identity of the religious community overshadowed any individual contribution. This anonymity wasn't just a matter of professional modesty, it was a societal expectation. Women in general were not seen as individuals who warranted public recognition or individual fame. Their identity was often subsumed under that of their father, husband, or religious order. Legal documents, property deeds, and even gravestones rarely mentioned a woman's individual achievements unless they were directly tied to their male relatives or their status within a religious hierarchy. To be an artist implied a level of public presence and individual mastery that was simply not aligned with the societal expectations for women. Think about women who worked alongside their artisan husbands or fathers. A woman might have been an invaluable assistant in a pottery workshop, mixing clays, preparing glazes, or even shaping vessels. She might have helped her husband in a painter's studio, grinding pigments or preparing surfaces. She might have been crucial to the success of a weaving business, producing intricate design. The final product, the mastercraft, would invariably be attributed to the man. His name would be on the workshop, his reputation would be on the line, and his skill would be celebrated. Contributions, however essential, were seen as an extension of his labor, part of her wifely duty to support the family trade. This lack of attribution had several profound consequences. First, it deprived women of the public validation that can fuel artistic ambition. Your work will never be signed, never celebrated as yours. How much incentive is there to push boundaries or innovate? Second, it meant that women rarely built individual reputations that could attract patronage. Patrons, whether wealthy nobles or church officials, sought out known masters. Without a public record of a woman's unique skill or style, she could not compete for commissions, which were the lifeblood of artistic creation in the High Middle Ages. Third, it created a historical void. We have very little direct evidence of individual women's artistic achievements from 1108 precisely, because their contributions were not recorded or attributed. This makes it difficult for us today to even know the full extent of their artistic involvement, further cementing their historical invisibility. Even when women did create works that clearly demonstrated immense skill, perhaps a particularly intricate tapestry, a finely embroidered altar cloth, or a beautifully illustrated book, the credit remained elusive. These items would be admired for their beauty and craftsmanship, but not for the specific hand that created them, if that hand belonged to a woman. The art existed, but the artist remained in the shadows, her identity subsumed by the demands of a world that valued collective anonymity for its female creators. This subtle yet powerful limitation meant that women's artistic expressions, no matter how profound or beautiful, rarely found their way into the public consciousness as the work of an individual talent. It was a barrier of silence, built from societal expectations and historical oversight, that kept women's artistic voices from truly echoing through time. Number 7, legal status and property rights. Imagine living in a world where your very existence, your rights, and your ability to control property were entirely dependent on the men in your life. This was the stark reality for women in 1108. Their legal status, or rather, their lack of an independent legal status, cast a long, limiting shadow over any aspirations for artistic expression. Without the right to own property, enter contracts, or control their own finances, women faced immense barriers to pursuing art beyond the most domestic and anonymous forms. In 1108, the legal systems across Europe, influenced by Roman and Germanic traditions, largely adhered to the principle of male guardianship. A woman's legal identity was almost always tied to a man, her father, her husband, or, if widowed, sometimes her son or a male guardian appointed by the court. This meant that she generally could not act as an independent legal person. She couldn't sign contracts, bring lawsuits, or make significant financial decisions without the consent and involvement of her male guardian. Think about what this meant for an aspiring artist. Creating art, especially high art like manuscript illumination, sculpture, or large-scale paintings, required significant resources. These resources included expensive materials, pigments, gold leaf, fine parchment made from animal skins, specialized tools, and often a dedicated space or workshop. These items were costly, and acquiring them required financial means. A woman, largely without control over her own wealth or property, could not easily purchase these necessities. If she inherited land or money, it often came under the management of her husband upon marriage. Her dowry, which was a significant financial contribution she brought to her marriage, became her husband's property to manage, even if it was intended to support her in some way. Furthermore, the legal system often prevented women from owning productive assets like workshops or studios independently. An artisan's workshop was a piece of property, equipped with tools and materials, and often served as a place of business. Own and operate such a space required legal standing and economic independence that most women simply did not possess. Even if a woman had exceptional skill, she could not legally establish herself as an independent artist, acquire a workshop, or take on commissions in her own name. Any work she produced, or any income derived from it, would legally belong to her husband or father. Consider the scenario of a woman who was a gifted scribe or illuminator. If she wasn't in a convent, where communal ownership and the church's patronage might allow her to work, she would face insurmountable legal hurdles. She couldn't buy her own vellum or ink. She couldn't enter into a contract with a patron to create a manuscript. If she somehow managed to create a work, the profits from its sale would legally belong to her husband. This severely disincentivized professional artistic pursuits for women outside of monastic settings. Even within aristocratic circles, where women might manage estates in their husband's absence or widowhood, their control was often temporary or limited. While a widowed noblewoman might have more autonomy, she would still be expected to remarry or appoint a male guardian, and her focus would be on managing the estate for her children and upholding the family line, not on funding independent artistic endeavors for herself. Historical legal texts and customs from the early 12th century, though varied across regions, consistently reinforce this dependent status. A woman's legal capacity was typically covered by her male guardian, a concept often referred to later as coverture. This meant that her legal rights and obligations were absorbed into those of her husband upon marriage. Without a distinct legal identity, a woman could not act as a principal in financial or property transactions, making it almost impossible to function as a professional artist or patron. This profound lack of legal and property rights created an iron cage around women's artistic ambitions. It denied them access to the resources needed for art, the autonomy required to pursue it professionally, and the independent legal standing to profit from their creations. While some women, particularly within convents or through the indirect support of their families, might have found avenues for artistic expression, the vast majority were legally and economically constrained, their potential creativity stifled by the very laws and customs of their time. It meant that for many women, the dream of creating beautiful things remained just that, a dream, because the practical and legal means to achieve it were simply beyond their grasp. Number 6. Exclusion from guilds and apprenticeships. Imagine wanting to learn a highly specialized craft, a skill that takes years of dedication and practice to master, but being completely shut out from the very institutions that teach it. That was the reality for women in 1108 when it came to many forms of artistic expression, because the pathways to becoming a skilled artist primarily through guilds and apprenticeships were largely, if not entirely, closed to them. This exclusion wasn't just a missed opportunity, it was a systemic barrier that prevented women from accessing professional artistic training and networks. Though not as fully developed as they would become in later centuries, the foundations of artisan guilds were already forming in the early 12th century. These were associations of craftsmen who regulated their trade, set standards for quality, trained new members, and controlled access to the profession. Whether it was stonemasons, carpenters, goldsmiths, painters, or scribes, the path to mastery was typically through an apprenticeship. A young person would live with a master craftsman, learning the trade over many years, often for a decade or more, before becoming a journeyman and eventually a master themselves. For women, this system presented an insurmountable obstacle. Apprenticeships were overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, reserved for boys and young men. The reasons were complex and deeply rooted in medieval society. Firstly, many trades involved physical labor deemed unsuitable for women, or required travel, and a public presence that was considered inappropriate. Secondly, apprenticeships were often seen as a pathway to a male-dominated profession, and a woman's place was generally understood to be in the home, not in a public workshop. Thirdly, the social dynamics within a master's household, where apprentices lived and worked, were structured around male mentorship. Even in trades that might seem less physically demanding, like manuscript illumination or fine metalwork, women were generally excluded from formal apprenticeship. While a master's daughter or wife might learn some skills by observation within the household, this was not the same as a formal apprenticeship that led to full membership in a guild or recognized mastery of the craft. Without the structured training, the access to specialized tools and materials provided by a master, and the professional network that came with guild membership, it was nearly impossible for a woman to develop her artistic talents to a professional level or to compete for significant commissions. Consider the skills required for creating a masterpiece of medieval art. A manuscript illuminator needed to know how to prepare parchment, grind pigments, mix paints, draw intricate designs, apply gold leaf, and often understand Latin and religious iconography. A sculptor needed to understand stone, tools, anatomy, and architectural principles. These weren't skills one simply picked up casually. They required years of dedicated instruction from experienced masters. If a woman couldn't access these training pathways, her artistic potential, no matter how great, would remain largely undeveloped or confined to simpler, less recognized forms. There were very rare exceptions, of course. Some convents provided a limited form of artistic training, particularly in manuscript illumination, for their nuns. These cloistered environments offered a protected space where women could learn and practice artistic skills, though often within the confines of religious instruction and communal production. However, even these opportunities were not universal, and the artistic output was typically for the convent itself or the church, not for the open market or individual recognition. For the vast majority of women outside of these religious orders, formal artistic training was simply out of reach. The guilds, once fully established, became powerful gatekeepers. They controlled who could practice a trade, ensuring quality and limiting competition. To be a recognized artist meant to be a member of a guild, to have proven your mastery through a rigorous process. Since women were largely barred from this process, they were effectively locked out of the professional artistic world. Couldn't open their own studios, hire apprentices, or legally sell their work as independent masters. Any artistic work they did would be under the authority of a male relative or a religious institution. This exclusion created a profound vacuum. It meant that a huge segment of the population, half of humanity, was systematically denied the opportunity to develop their artistic talents through formal channels. Imagine all the potential Mozarts, Michelangelos, or Da Vinci's who were women in 1108, their innate talents unrecognized and undeveloped because the very institutions that fostered artistic excellence were closed to them. The limitation wasn't just about lack of access. It was about the denial of a pathway to professional development and the erasure of an entire gender from the formal artistic landscape of the High Middle Ages. Number 5. Restricted mobility and public presence. Imagine a life where your movements were tightly controlled, where stepping outside certain prescribed boundaries was seen as scandalous, dangerous, or simply unthinkable. This was the lived reality for most women in 1108, and it created a profound, almost invisible, barrier to their artistic expression. The restricted mobility and limited public presence of women meant they couldn't access art markets, learn from diverse influences, or seek out patronage in the wider world. In the High Middle Ages, society was structured around clear gender roles, and a woman's place was overwhelmingly considered to be in the domestic sphere. For noblewomen, this meant managing the household, raising children, and overseeing domestic servants within the confines of a castle or manor. Peasant women, it involved laboring on the land and in the home, often close to their village. For women in towns, their lives revolved around their immediate neighborhood and their family's dwelling or shop. Unchaperoned travel, especially for single women, was rare and often viewed with suspicion. A woman who was seen wandering alone or engaging in public life without a clear, acceptable reason could face severe social consequences, including damage to her reputation, which was paramount. Think about how this would impact an artist. Art, particularly high art of the era, was not created in a vacuum. It was often commissioned, displayed, and admired in public spaces: churches, cathedrals, noble courts, and town squares. Artists needed to travel to meet patrons, observe other works, gather materials from different places, and perhaps even study in different regions or workshops. A sculptor might travel to quarries to select the finest stone. A painter might journey to a distant monastery to study new techniques. An illuminator might need to visit a market to acquire rare pigments from distant lands. For women, such mobility was largely impossible. They couldn't easily journey to a distant city to find a patron. Couldn't travel to another workshop to learn from a renowned master. Couldn't frequent public marketplaces to observe the latest trends or acquire specialized materials. Their world was often confined to their immediate environment, severely limiting their exposure to different artistic styles, techniques, and inspiration. How can one truly innovate or expand their artistic vocabulary if they are only exposed to the art of their immediate village or manor? Furthermore, seeking patronage required a public presence and the ability to network. Artists, especially those seeking large commissions, would need to present their skills, negotiate terms, and cultivate relationships with wealthy and influential individuals, usually men. For a woman, approaching a powerful nobleman or a high-ranking church official directly to solicit a commission would have been highly unusual, socially awkward, and perhaps even dangerous. Her voice would likely not be heard, or she might be seen as forward or immodest. The social etiquette of the time dictated that women did not engage in such public, independent negotiations. Even within cities, women's movement was often restricted. While they might visit local markets for household needs or attend church, their activities were generally confined to the known and familiar. Bustling streets, the taverns where deals were made, the workshops where masters held sway, these were predominantly male spaces. A woman venturing into such spaces to promote her art would be an anomaly, drawing unwanted attention, and likely facing suspicion rather than opportunity. The main exception, once again, was the convent. Within the cloistered walls of a nunnery, women had a degree of protected space where they could move more freely, access resources, and engage in communal artistic endeavors like manuscript illumination. However, even these activities were internally focused and rarely led to external recognition or opportunities. The art produced in convents was for the glory of God and the use of the community, not for public display or sale in the wider world. Historical accounts from the High Middle Ages, such as chronicles or legal codes, consistently reflect a society where women's lives were spatially constrained. Travel was difficult and dangerous for everyone, but for women, the social implications of independent movement were far more severe. This lack of mobility meant that women were largely cut off from the dynamic exchange of artistic ideas, the direct engagement with patrons, and the broader world where artistic careers were forged. It essentially confined their artistic expression to the domestic sphere or to the cloistered walls of religious institutions, far away from the public eye and the opportunities that came with it. This restriction on physical presence was a significant, if often unstated, limitation on the scope and recognition of women's artistic contributions in 1108. Number 4, economic dependence and lack of resources. Imagine having a brilliant artistic vision, knowing exactly what you want to create, but lacking the very fundamental means to make it real: money. In 1108, this was a crippling reality for most women, whose pervasive economic dependence and limited access to financial resources acted as a monumental barrier to any significant artistic expression. Without money, you couldn't buy materials, hire assistants, or secure a dedicated space, effectively stifling even the most passionate creative urges. The medieval economy was predominantly agricultural and feudal. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of the landowning nobility and the church. For the vast majority of people, whether peasant or town dweller, life was a struggle for subsistence. For women, their economic standing was almost entirely derived from their male relatives. A daughter was dependent on her father. A wife was dependent on her husband. A widow might have some control over her dowry or dower, a portion of her husband's estate set aside for her support. But even then, her economic independence was often limited or temporary, and she might still be pressured to remarry. Think about the cost of artistic materials in 1108. They were often incredibly expensive. Pigments, for example, were made from rare minerals, plants, or even crushed insects, often imported from distant lands. Lapis lazuli, used for the vibrant blue ultramarine, was sourced from Afghanistan and was more expensive than gold. Gold leaf, used in illuminated manuscripts, was, naturally, gold. Fine parchment or vellum, made from carefully prepared animal skins, was labor-intensive to produce and therefore costly. Specialized tools, brushes, chisels, mallets, engraving tools, were also not cheap and required skilled blacksmiths or artisans to craft. A woman, typically without her own income or control over household finances, simply could not afford these materials. Her daily life was often focused on contributing to the family's basic needs through labor, not on acquiring luxury items for personal artistic pursuits. Even if she managed to save a few coins, the quantities needed for any substantial artistic project would be out of reach. For instance, creating even a single page of an illuminated manuscript could require materials costing more than a common laborer earned in a month. Beyond materials, there was the cost of time. For a professional artist, time was money. They would work full-time on commissions. For a woman, however, time was a precious commodity, almost entirely consumed by domestic duties, agricultural labor, or child rearing. Any time she devoted to artistic endeavors would mean less time for these essential tasks, potentially impacting the family's survival. Without economic independence, she couldn't afford to buy time away from her responsibilities to focus on art. Consider the notion of patronage. In the High Middle Ages, most significant art was created under the patronage of the church, powerful monarchs, or wealthy nobles. These patrons would commission works, providing the necessary funds for materials and the artist's sustenance. For a woman to secure such patronage was almost impossible. As discussed, her restricted mobility and public presence made it difficult to even approach potential patrons. Furthermore, patrons typically sought out established male masters, whose reputations were built through apprenticeships and guild membership. A woman, largely invisible in the public sphere and without formal training, would struggle to gain the trust or recognition needed to attract such financial backing. Even in rare cases where women within convents engaged in artistic production, the resources came from the convent's collective wealth, often from dowries brought by noble nuns or donations from wealthy patrons. The individual nun herself did not control the purse strings. She was simply contributing to a communal effort that was funded by the institution. Historical economic records from the early 12th century, though incomplete for individual lives, consistently show a highly stratified society where economic power resided with men. Women's economic roles were largely supportive and secondary, not independent or entrepreneurial. The dowry system, though it transferred property, often placed it under the husband's control. Legal documents about property and inheritance reveal that direct female control over significant assets was uncommon. This fundamental lack of economic power and access to resources was a concrete, tangible limitation. It wasn't just a societal expectation, it was a practical impossibility for most women to pursue art that required significant investment. Without the funds to buy materials, the leisure time to practice, or the means to secure patronage, the vast majority of women in 1108, no matter how talented, were barred from creating anything beyond the most basic and inexpensive forms of expression, largely confined to the realm of household crafts or oral traditions. It was a barrier of empty pockets, silencing countless potential artists before they could ever begin. Number 3. Religious doctrine and church control. Imagine a world where the most powerful institution, the one that shaped every aspect of life from birth to death, also dictated what art could be created, who could create it, and what messages it could convey. In 1108, the Roman Catholic Church was that institution, and its pervasive control, combined with its specific religious doctrines regarding women, formed a formidable barrier to female artistic expression. This wasn't just about general societal influence, it was a direct, ideological, and practical limitation. In the High Middle Ages, the Church was not just a spiritual guide, it was a massive landowner, a powerful political force, and the primary patron of the arts. Most significant art of the era cathedrals, stained glass, frescoes, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts served a religious purpose. They were created to glorify God, instruct the illiterate masses about Christian doctrine, or adorn places of worship. To create such art, an artist needed to understand complex theological concepts, biblical narratives, and the specific iconography approved by the Church. Church's teachings, deeply rooted in interpretations of biblical texts and early Christian fathers, often portrayed women in a complex, often contradictory light. On one hand, figures like the Virgin Mary were revered as symbols of purity and motherhood. On the other hand, women were frequently associated with Eve, temptation, and sinfulness. This dualistic view, combined with the general patriarchal structure of society, led to a limited role for women within the church hierarchy. Women could become nuns and abbesses, wielding spiritual and administrative power within their convents, but they were explicitly barred from priesthood and direct roles in leading public worship or shaping doctrine. This exclusion from direct religious authority had a profound impact on artistic expression. Since the church was the primary patron and arbiter of taste, artists often worked directly under the guidance of bishops, abbots, or other male clerics. These men dictated the subject matter, style, and theological correctness of the art. A woman excluded from these decision-making circles had no direct influence over the narratives, symbols, or messages that art conveyed. Her interpretations or creative impulses, if they differed from established doctrine, would simply not find an outlet in major church commissions. Consider the vast body of religious art created in 1108. Depicted saints, biblical scenes, theological allegories, and the lives of Christ and Mary. To contribute to this art, an artist needed extensive knowledge of scripture and church history, and the ability to represent these stories in a way that was both aesthetically pleasing and doctrinally sound. While some women in convents might have gained this knowledge, their artistic output was always in service of the religious community and its specific, approved practices, not an independent expression of personal theology. Art produced in convents was usually communal and often remained anonymous, as discussed earlier. Furthermore, the church's emphasis on asceticism and humility could discourage overt individual artistic expression, especially for women. The idea of an individual woman seeking fame or public recognition for her art might have been seen as a form of vanity or pride, which was contrary to Christian ideals of humility. For women, who were already often seen as needing more spiritual guidance due to the Eve archetype, such self-expression could be particularly frowned upon. The church's control also extended to censorship. Any art that was deemed heretical, morally questionable, or simply outside the bounds of approved iconography would be suppressed. This meant that even if a woman dared to express a unique theological perspective through her art, it would likely never see the light of day. Fear of religious censure, which could range from social ostracism to excommunication, was a powerful deterrent against artistic experimentation that deviated from established norms. Historical sources like monastic rules, church decrees, and theological treatises from the early 12th century illustrate the pervasive influence of the church and its specific views on gender roles. These documents often emphasize female piety, domestic virtues, and obedience, reinforcing the idea that women's contributions were best made within the confines of private devotion or communal religious life, not through public artistic innovation or leadership. In essence, the Church in 1108 acted as both the primary engine and the primary gatekeeper of artistic expression. For women, their exclusion from positions of authority within the Church, combined with doctrines that limited their public roles and emphasized their humility, created a profound and ideological barrier. It meant that while women might have been part of the artistic process in certain religious settings, their capacity for independent, recognized, or doctrinally innovative artistic expression was severely curtailed by the very institution that otherwise championed the creation of beauty. It was a spiritual and practical limitation, shaping the very soul of medieval art and effectively silencing countless potential female voices within it. Number 2, societal expectations and gender roles. Imagine a world where your entire life path is predetermined by your gender, where deeply ingrained beliefs about what a woman should be and should do dictate every choice, every opportunity. In 1108, rigid societal expectations and deeply entrenched gender roles created an almost impenetrable wall around women's artistic expression, far beyond what any law or lack of money could achieve alone. This wasn't just about what was forbidden, it was about what was simply unthinkable for a woman to pursue. Medieval society was highly patriarchal, meaning it was organized around the principle of male authority and leadership. Men were seen as the public face of the family and community, responsible for protection, governance, and economic provision. Women, in contrast, were primarily relegated to the domestic sphere. Their main purpose was seen as marriage, childbearing, and managing the household. This wasn't a choice, it was the fundamental social contract. Think about the ideal medieval woman. She was pious, chaste, obedient, and diligent in her domestic duties. Her worth was often measured by her ability to bear healthy children, particularly sons, and to manage a harmonious household. Any ambition that veered outside these prescribed roles, like pursuing a career as a sculptor, a painter, or a public storyteller, would have been seen as highly unusual, possibly scandalous, and certainly inappropriate. A woman who neglected her household duties to pursue an artistic passion might be seen as selfish, neglectful, or even immoral. Consider the pressure to marry and bear children. Marriage was often a social and economic arrangement, not solely a matter of personal affection. For women, it was almost universal. If a woman was not married, she faced social stigma and economic precarity unless she entered a convent. Once married, her time and energy were almost entirely consumed by pregnancy, childbirth, and the demanding care of numerous children, often in difficult conditions. This biological reality, combined with the societal expectation, meant that most women had little to no leisure time for personal artistic pursuits. A woman's day was filled with grinding grain, preparing food, fetching water, spinning thread, weaving cloth, cleaning, and caring for a large family. There was no free time for art as we might understand it today. Even if a woman had a natural talent, the societal structure offered no clear pathway for its development or public display. Artistic professions were considered men's work. They often involved physical labor, travel, apprenticeships in male-dominated workshops, and public interactions, all things deemed unsuitable for women. The very idea of a woman traveling alone to sell her paintings or carve a public statue would have been considered absurd and dangerous, inviting ridicule or worse. The social pressure to conform was immense. Deviance from these gender norms could lead to social ostracism, a severe punishment in a communal society. A woman who stubbornly pursued an independent artistic career might find herself unmarried, shunned by her community, and economically destitute. The risks were simply too high for most to even contemplate such a path. While women certainly engaged in crafts like spinning, weaving, and embroidery, these were deeply embedded within their expected domestic roles. They were seen as practical skills necessary for the household, not as art in the grand public sense. Even if a woman embroidered an exquisite tapestry, it was usually for her family's use or as a gift, not for public display or sale as a recognized work of art by an individual artist. The societal expectation was that her creative energies would be channeled into making her home beautiful and functional, not into professional artistic endeavors. Historical texts from the early 12th century, such as didactic literature, chronicles, and sermons, consistently reinforce these gender roles. They extol the virtues of domesticity, piety, and obedience for women, and emphasize men's roles in public life, warfare, and governance. There is very little mention of women as independent artistic creators because the very concept ran contrary to the prevailing social order. This pervasive web of societal expectations and gender roles created a powerful, silent limitation. It wasn't just about rules, it was about the air women breathed, the ideas they were taught from birth, and the very structure of their lives. It meant that for the vast majority of women in 1108, the path of an artist was not just difficult, it was simply culturally unimaginable. Their artistic spirit, if it existed, was forced to find expression within the narrow confines of their expected roles, largely unseen and uncelebrated by the wider world. It was a barrier built not of stone or metal, but of deeply ingrained social norms, a formidable and pervasive limit on women's creative potential. Number 1, lack of formal education and literacy. Imagine a world where knowledge, especially written knowledge, is a tightly guarded treasure, and access to it is overwhelmingly denied to you. In 1108, for the vast majority of women, this was the stark reality. Pervasive lack of formal education and literacy was arguably the single most significant and foundational barrier to women's artistic expression, acting as a gatekeeper to countless forms of creativity and influence. In the High Middle Ages, literacy was rare, even among men. It was primarily the domain of the clergy and a small percentage of the nobility and merchants. Education was not universal, it was specialized, often focused on religious texts, Latin, and administrative skills. For women, educational opportunities were even more limited. While some aristocratic girls might receive basic religious instruction or learn to manage a household, formal schooling was largely unheard of for them. The few places where women might receive an education were convents. Think about the most prestigious and intricate art forms of 1108, illuminated manuscripts. These were books, often religious texts like Bibles, psalters, or liturgical works, meticulously copied and adorned with stunning illustrations, intricate borders, and gilded initials. To create such a work, an artist needed to be literate, not just in their vernacular language, but crucially in Latin, the universal language of scholarship, religion, and administration. They needed to understand the text they were illustrating, its theological nuances, and its narrative flow. For women who were generally not taught to read or write, especially in Latin, the world of manuscript illumination was largely closed off. How could one illustrate a biblical scene if they couldn't read the accompanying text? How could one become a skilled scribe if they couldn't even form letters? Even if a woman had an innate talent for drawing or color, the intellectual and linguistic barriers were insurmountable. The skills required for these high arts were inextricably linked to literacy and academic knowledge. Beyond manuscripts, consider other forms of art that required advanced knowledge. Textual designs often involved mathematical principles and geometric understanding, rooted in learned traditions. The iconography of religious frescoes and sculptures was complex, requiring a deep understanding of Christian history and theology. While some oral traditions existed, formal artistic creation, especially for public display or commissioned works, was almost always tied to the literate world. For women outside of convents, the daily reality was one focused on practical survival and domestic duties. Their education, if it existed, was informal and centered on household management, rudimentary herbal knowledge, and perhaps basic counting. There was no societal impetus to teach girls to read or write, as it was not seen as necessary for their future roles as wives and mothers. Indeed, in some contexts, too much education for women might have been viewed with suspicion, as it could lead to independent thought or a challenge to male authority. Convents offered a rare exception. Within the cloister, noblewomen who entered religious life might learn to read and write Latin, and some became accomplished scribes and illuminators. These women were often from aristocratic families who could afford to send their daughters to convents and who brought valuable books and resources with them. However, even in these settings, the education was primarily religious, and the artistic output was communal, often anonymous, and produced for the internal use of the convent or the church, not for public recognition or the wider art market. The vast majority of women who lived outside these cloistered walls had no such opportunities. Historical records, such as charters, wills, and educational treatises from the early 12th century, consistently show that literacy rates were extremely low, and disproportionately so for women. Few references to female literacy almost always pertain to noblewomen within religious orders. This statistical reality speaks volumes. The lack of formal education and literacy was not just a minor inconvenience, it was a fundamental roadblock. It prevented women from accessing the knowledge, skills, and intellectual frameworks necessary to participate in the most celebrated and professional art forms of the High Middle Ages. Without the ability to read the sacred texts they might illustrate, or to understand the Latin necessary for learned discourse, or even to write contracts for commissions, women were systematically excluded from the pathways to artistic mastery. It ensured that their creative energies, if they found expression at all, were confined to forms that did not require the written word, relegating them to the periphery of the recognized artistic world. This was a barrier built of ink and parchment, a silent testament to the limited horizons for women with artistic aspirations in 1108.